All for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. All for me beer and tobacco. Well, I spent all me tin with the ladies drinking gin. Now across the western ocean I must wander.
Where are me crew, me jolly, jolly crew? They're all gone for beer and tobacco. Since the COVID came around and the pubs all they shut down, now I'm missing singing songs with you together.
Oh, all for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. All for me beer and tobacco. Well, I spent all me tin with the ladies drinking gin. Now across the western ocean I must wander. Yes, across the western ocean I must wander.
Well, thank you, Zoom Meister, I should say. I am Joan Whitlow, and I am the Executive Director of the Customs House Maritime Museum. So welcome, everybody. Before we start, I have a few announcements. Rules of the game. I think everyone by now is familiar that the Zoom Meister has turned off the microphone and the video for everyone to keep down noise and any kind of distractions. But at the end of the program, we certainly invite everyone to definitely turn them back on and be engaging within the questions and answers that we will have with our presenter. In the meantime, if you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to enter into the chat, that's always an option. I will be monitoring that, and if appropriate, I can always interrupt or flag Susan to respond at that moment. Otherwise, we will hold them until the end. So many may know that I took early retirement from MIT back in 2019. When hired as the executive director, I was asked to give a 3-year commitment. And unfortunately, I'm approaching that milestone. It's been a great experience and challenge to have worked at the Customs House Maritime Museum, which I truly have enjoyed. My only regret is that I didn't start sooner, but then maybe the situation would not have been what it is today. In the coming weeks, you may notice a job posting for the ED position. I want to reassure everybody that this is all part of the strategy to search for the next executive director. I have every intention of handing over the baton in a responsible manner for a smooth transition for the organization. To ensure that there is continuity in operations, Diara Torres, known as Dee, began full-time as the executive assistant to support many of the administrative duties. Another big staff change, Maureen Wolf, store manager, will be leaving after 5 years of dedicated work. Maureen guided the store through much change into what it is today, and Janice Drake will be stepping into the role as store manager in the coming weeks. These winter months, the museum has been open, and those who visit have been pleased that there is something to do in Newburyport. On the days that we have been closed, we're quite busy. Thanks to 2 generous members, we have acquired the funds to protect 2 important objects in the collections. Dr. Freeman, who donated the Captain's William Nichols portrait, recently provided funds by he and his wife to reframe the pastel portrait in the original reverse painted glass mat and frame. The plan is to have the Northeast Document Conservation Center introduce spacers and archival materials for the backing to help with the air circulation and to mitigate the aging process. The Jeanette Isabella Conservation Fund has conserved 7 paintings in the museum's collection. Jeanette has been a long supporter of the arts, and with her and her friends' donations, have provided the funds now to have the William York ship's portrait of the Montana conserved by the Northeast Painting Conservation, formerly known as the Anthony Moore of York, Maine. Lastly, since we have been busy with the installations of the 2 new exhibitions, on April 2nd, we will publicly open legendary Newburyporters sculpture by Jeffrey Briggs. There are 14 small sculptures of people who once called Newburyport home. This is not your average typical exhibition for history, nor is it an art installation. Production of the exhibition involved over 36 advisors, writers, and one artist. The book, Legendary Newburyporters, A Chronicle of Achievement in 18th and 19th Century, was edited by Jesse and Marge Motes. A community came together to offer research and support for the initiative. The H. Patterson Hale Jr. Charitable Foundation is a presenting sponsor, and the Newburyport Bank as the major sponsor. Charles Griffin provided funds for the video production of Bob Watts, capturing the production of Timothy Palmer from conceptualization through final statue, then edited by Jason Novak. And now is your chance to be part of the legendary Newburyporters as citizen sponsors. Keeping it in the spirit of participatory, you can donate at whatever level you feel comfortable with, starting at $50 or above, to have your name or your organization or your company associated with a particular statue. For $50 or more, you'll have your name in the exhibition on a panel in the gallery. For $250, your name will be listed on the short pedestal label. And for $500 or more, your name will be listed on the ID pedestal panel and on the dedication page within the book. Interested? Please look for a button on the homepage to be a citizen sponsor. And come see 4 spectacular paintings by John Sheedy. Dormant vessels along the waterfront depict a time when boats and vessels venturing on the Merrimack are returned to the scattered boatyards along the waterfront. Obviously, that's winter, like a day like today with the snow and the ice. There really are spectacular paintings. But tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Susan McGregor Harvey. Susan is a graduate of Wellesley College, first entered the hospital administration and management at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and then later worked at the Mass General Hospital in the Department of Cardiology. A volunteer position in 1999 with the Habitat of Humanity changed her life and career as she discovered she was managing a program in Littleton, where she lived. She ended up actually successfully bringing the project to conclusion, and it made her really reassess her life. She wanted to make an impact. So Susan returned to school at the Fitchburg State University for her MA in history. I believe that is her thesis that was the catalyst for the topic that we will hear more of tonight. Susan has since been a lecturer at Wellesley College, but a teacher at heart. She has been with the Littleton Public Schools in their History and Social Studies Department since 2005. Please welcome Susan for tonight's presentation, Slavery in Massachusetts, Newburyport Connections.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. If you can't, please raise your hand, get in the chat, do something like that. I am so grateful to have had this invitation, and really grateful that Joan tracked me down, because it was a little bit confusing when we were chatting about this in the fall. And I am very, very grateful to our Zoom Meister, Jack Santos, for making this possible. I regret that we are not all together at the Custom House Maritime Museum tonight, but Zoom, without Jack, we wouldn't be doing this at all. So I'm really grateful for that. And this was a lousy day to be on the road, so it probably makes just as much sense that we're doing it this way. So I thank you, Joan, for that nice introduction. Working for Habitat did change my life. I have parents who were educators, lots of people in my family who were educators, and I decided to go back into teaching. And I started doing that when I was 51. So this is my master's thesis work that I've been working on. And my very first visit to the Customs House Maritime Museum was over a decade ago when I was doing this. And I'm going to bring up, if I can, Jack, help me if you need to. Let's see if we can do this. Okay. Jack, am I good?
Perfect.
Great, thank you. Okay. So tonight, I have spoken in Newburyport before. In fact, this is probably my 5th talk. This is more focused on the ships this time than anything else, which seemed to be appropriate for the Custom House Maritime Museum. And a fabulous building that it is. This is sort of my thank you. I adore this building. I love wandering around through it. I'm sorry that I never met Joan when I was there, but I have gone in many, many times and intend to come back again. Jack and Joan and I were talking about a new project for me. So let's talk about, for a minute, the maritime past. I mean, this is what we think of when we think of Newburyport, right? Well, Revolutionary War, we were privateering. More privateers came out of Newburyport than just about any other place in Massachusetts. And in 1789, Congress established Newburyport as one of 9 customs collection districts. Because it was a major port on the eastern seaboard. You already know this. You are members of this amazing museum. In 1790, the US Coast Guard was formed, and the first revenue cutter, the Massachusetts, was built and put into service here in 1791. Then, and I think this is very cool, 1798, building of the first US Navy ship, the USS Merrimack, placed into service in the Quasi-War. This came up in a conversation earlier this week. Nobody talks about it much, but it was terribly important. And then, of course, we have the Clipper Heritage Trail. This celebrates 300 years of building sailing ships in Newburyport along the Merrimack River. And that age of sail in the 19th century, much of it is represented in the Customs House Museum, and beautifully, I might say. So this I took from a website, from thepreservationist.com. Newburyport, this was the point of contact for exotic goods from all over the world. It was the point of contact for exotic people coming from all over the world. This is where the hum of commerce grew hottest and drew a flurry of human activity. It was the wharves that put the port into Newburyport. In fact, so much history about Newburyport has to do with the prominent characters who owned some part of the warehouses, or in some cases, the wharves themselves that shaped our history. I would add the ships as well. Now, that's probably familiar to you, 1640 map of Newbury. You can tell why the first settlers settled there. Look at that water and that access. That's amazing. And a much more contemporary view of our access to the Atlantic. It's remarkable. Well, where do I get off talking about this? I'm a Newburyporter at heart. I am a descendant of first settler, Anthony Morse. My husband is a descendant of Richard Bartlett. But I grew up in Northern Ohio, and he grew up all over the place. We did not move to Newburyport, and we probably should have, but there you are. So I'm related by marriage to the Noyes, the Sanborn, the Philbrook families, the Tucks, the Batchelders. He got kicked out of Newburyport. As Jack told me this week, I probably would be referred to as an inbred townie if I did live in Newburyport. I'll take that as a compliment. So my first visit to the Custom House Maritime Museum, as I said earlier, was more than a decade ago, and I was doing research for my master's thesis. My master's thesis was really revolving around my family and what aspects my family had, what involvement they had with the slave trade. So here's the question: to what extent did the economies of Newbury and Newburyport rely upon the transatlantic slave trade and the slave-powered islands of the West Indies? This is the sign that is inside the Custom House Maritime Museum, just inside the door, or it was when I first saw it. Newbury exported fish and timber to the West Indies to be exchanged for molasses and sugar. Part of the cargo was re-exported to Europe. Part was kept in New England and the molasses made into rum. This profitable triangle trade formed the base of the New England economy. Now, I read that and I was looking at something else when another group of people came into the museum, starting their self-guided tour. And a woman who was about my age at that point said out loud, "But the triangle trade means slavery. There were no slaves here." And she drew in the air that familiar triangle. And that was, of course, that you've got ships with rum to Africa, ships with slaves to the Caribbean, and ships with slaves to the southern part of the Americas. Well, that's what I grew up knowing in Ohio. And that's what most people grew up knowing in New England. But it is much more complicated than that. So that's not exactly a triangle. And it doesn't have, you can see the lines that are going back and forth to Newport, to Salem, to Boston, to the West Indies, to the sugar colonies. That's where our economy was basically based. That's it. Now, it's more complicated than that. And this is not just the triangle. So just bear this map in mind. When we talk about slavery, I have had this conversation many times. Well, everybody had slavery. Well, slavery is a virtually universal feature of human history. And in most societies, people who were enslaved were prisoners of war, and slavery was not for life. Slaves were outsiders. They were excluded from basic recognition and rights enjoyed by free people. This changed, and this changed with European colonizers. The concept of race actually began in the 16th century to distinguish native populations from European colonizers. Race is not biologically determined. This is a socio-political construct. This idea of creating race, American colonists justified enslavement of Africans in terms of religion and culture. And by 1770s, this justification was replaced by an explicit theory of race. Now, this didn't happen overnight. As you can see, we're talking about from 1620s to, because the first Africans arrived in 1619 in Virginia, to the 1770s. So this was done in steps. And it went from the idea of becoming enslaved being inherited by the father to the mother. And by 1700, that was the case in all of the colonies. By 1770, we have Black people's inferiority was innate and ineradicable, a product of their physical nature, not their circumstances of condition. The first time this was specifically written down was in the Notes on the State of Virginia, which was actually sort of a sales brochure written by Thomas Jefferson. He's advertising how amazing Virginia and the United States is. Mind you, this is 1785, so this is after our Revolution. He wrote, of course, with some help from John Adams, all men are created equal in the Declaration in 1776. But in 1785, he said otherwise. Slavery was the cornerstone of colonization of the Americas. Before 1800, 10 million people crossed the Atlantic. 8.5 million of those people were enslaved Africans. Most Africans, just as that woman indicated, were taken to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean and to South America. But between 500 and 600,000 Africans were imported into mainland North America, into all colonies. I grew up believing that it was only in the South. It wasn't true. Just because we didn't have plantations doesn't mean we didn't have slaves. So once again, here is that sign. We are admitting it, but we're not really thinking about it. So slavery in New England. In 1624, a few African slaves were brought to Massachusetts. In 1638, New Englanders began importing Africans, exchanging Native Americans for Black slaves from the West Indies. Native Americans, of course, were being forced into slavery, and they made terrible slaves. So they were being exchanged for Black Africans who were in the West Indies. In 1641, Massachusetts began trading fish and pipe staves for Spanish wine and sugar. In 1641, Massachusetts also was the first colony to enshrine this in law, that it was legal to enslave people. In 1644, Boston traders sent 3 ships to Africa for gold dust and Negroes. The Africans were exchanged in the West Indies for wine, salt, sugar, and tobacco. And the discovery was made that the trade in Africans was very profitable, and the possibilities of trade with the West Indies seemingly endless. This creates our triangle trade. So as I said, in 1641, Massachusetts legally recognizes slavery into its mass body of liberties. Once we've done this, other colonies follow suit. Slaves became chattel, no different in law from horses, hand looms, any other disposable property. And by 1660, slave descent was traced through the maternal line, not the paternal, so that most children of what we would call mixed ancestry would be enslaved and increase an owner's property. This is from the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. There should never be any bond slavery unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. This exempts none. The argument, of course, is, oh my gosh, well, the Africans were selling them. Yeah, they were. But African slavery was different. African slavery had been, before Europeans arrived on the Gold Coast, African slavery had been, well, we're taking these people because we beat them in a war, in a battle, and they become our slaves, and it wasn't for life. Now they are being given trading, guns, alcohol, all kinds of little goods for African slaves because we need that labor. We need that labor. So yes, now we have Africans who are going and taking people from other tribes. All Africans are not the same. All tribes are not the same. They would not enslave their own. They took them from other tribes. So let's talk about what it meant to be trading in the West Indies in the 17th century. Well, here's a cargo list: barrel staves and hoops, shingles and boards, dried or pickled fish, flour, bread, butter, peas, beef, pork, cattle, poultry, and occasionally horses. All of that came from New England. New England's first census in 1715, there were approximately 158,000 white residents, 4,150 Blacks in the entire region. Massachusetts had the largest number of Africans with 2,000. Connecticut, 1,500, Rhode Island, 500, and New Hampshire, 150. Now, Rhode Island has its own special place here. Rhode Island has the distinction of having had more to do with the slave trade than any other colony or state in the country. New England really ran the slave trade. So in Essex County, 1754 and 1755, Newbury had 50 slaves. of whom 16 were female and 34 were male. Salem, a much bigger place, had 83. Gloucester had 61. And in 1764, Negroes and mulattoes, a term we no longer use, accounted for 1,070 people in a population of 43,751 in Essex County. And I think back to the woman saying, well, there were no slaves here. There were. And at the time of the Revolution in Littleton, Mass., which was incorporated in 1734, we had 11 slaves, and we are very tiny. So let's get on to the shipbuilding. Boston merchants looked to invest in shipyards where the access to timber was greater north of the city. Well, we had that. And we had a port. Between 1709 and 1714, Newbury launched almost twice as much tonnage as it had in the previous 6 years, continuing to build both coastal and ocean-going vessels. In 5 years, Newbury produced 28 sloops, 2 barks, 11 brigantines, and 11 ships, totaling 2,625 tons. This is early for this. In that same time, the entire Salem area produced only 47 ships. We were very busy here. By 1727, there were between 25 and 30 shipyards on the Merrimack River, primarily building vessels for the West Indies trade and some for the Atlantic slave trade. Now, the construction of a large, say 100 to 300 ton vessel could require up to 200 workers before a ship was ready to launch. Think about that number for a minute. 200 people working on a ship. Though carrying Africans directly to New England was not common, it did occur. 10,000 Africans reached New England directly from Africa from the beginning of the trade to 1867. Between 1709 and 1714, Newbury produced 28 sloops, 2 barks, 11 brigantines, 11 ships. You know this, right? So here's the thing. Where a ship was built did not necessarily indicate its port of registration nor of its ownership. And this is, I really want to make a point of this. And somebody in almost all of my talks says, well, were they all owned by people in Newburyport? No. Many owners were not from the colonies. Many owners were British, but they were built here. Investors in ships and cargo pooled their funds together based on social or business connections, just as we do anything else today. In 1710, 1 out of every 6 adult males in Newbury was a part owner of an ocean-going vessel, including a trader and a weaver. The investment made could turn out to be a very good investment. It's a little like playing the stock market. Partial ownership in vessels became very, very common and was found in all levels of society, all levels. This material, this information I have taken from the tables I have put together from the information that I gleaned from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Voyages database. From 1734 to 1858, there were 47 ships, 88 voyages, 22,629 Africans embarked on these slave trade ships. 19,037 disembarked. 3 ships were condemned. It's unknown how many enslaved disembarked after the vessel was condemned. So the total enslaved people who died on voyages was 3,582. 3,582 people. The construction of a large vessel, as I said before, could require up to 200 workers. So the smaller vessels used in the West Indies trade provided Newbury citizens with sugar, molasses, coffee, tobacco, and other products obtainable in the Caribbean. These are all products of slavery. The most common vessel for ocean voyages was the ship, and of those built in Newbury, 22 were built for the Atlantic slave trade. Rum became a valuable item in the trade for Africans, most of whom were sold in the Caribbean to harvest the crops that would come home north to New England. One of the things that I did with my research was to track down probate inventories. And most of you probably know this already, but a probate inventory is something that is taken at the time of a person's death to see what they have in their home, what they own, what money they have, and what they owe. Well, I went through quite a few of them, and this one of Samuel Moody in 1675. George Little and Benjamin Rolfe were the appraisers. Both were first settlers. His real estate was worth 1,342 pounds. And in his personal goods, he included a Negro boy worth 25 pounds. He had, for that time, a significant amount of money. Now, Captain Paul White is somebody probably known to most of you as well. A first settler, merchant and distiller. He had quite the wharf, and in his warehouse he had 4,000 pounds of sugar, 2 hogsheads of salt, 1/2 hogshead of molasses, 1,888 gallons of rum, and 2 still worms for distilling rum. In his shop, 84 gallons of rum, plus 4 hogsheads and 2 barrels of the same, and 1 old still with a part of a worm. He also had property in Barbados, which he acquired with his second wife. His effects there equaled 100 pounds. His entire estate was worth 22,035 pounds, or approximately, almost $500,000 in 2021. Not bad. Deacon Joshua Beck, 1747, jumping ahead, he had real estate, including half a right in the Long Wharf warehouse and a 16th part of a sloop, about 80 tons. Now that's an interesting piece right there. The fact that he could purchase a 16th part of a boat, right? This is funding these voyages, whether it's to the West Indies or whether it's to Africa. This is how you're funding them, because you are getting as many people to invest as possible. Listed under, in his probate inventory, listed under household furniture after 2 saddles and a bridle, was a Negro woman. What's interesting about the probate inventories, the really early ones, is that they're just all jumbled up. People like this Negro woman worth 45 pounds was literally listed after the saddles and the bridle. There's an entire page of in-shop goods that includes gloves and threads and many various fabrics that include silk and buttons and leather and ivory combs and things that he was getting in trade. Mr. John Crocker, his inventory contained items such as yards of calico, cotton, checked linen, stockings. He also had a great deal of molasses. He had sugar, he had coffee, he had allspice. This is West Indies trade. And he also owned, at the time of his death, the sloop Speedwell and 1/8 of the Duck schooner and 1/2 and 1/3 of another sloop whose name was not given. This is a statement made by the Massachusetts Trade and Fisheries in 1704. Excuse me, take a sip of water. Asserting that sugar and molasses were the main ingredients of the slave trade, the merchants claimed that any duty imposed upon these articles would ruin the fisheries, cause the destruction of the rum distilleries, and destroy the slave trade. Destruction of the Negro commerce would throw 5,000 seamen out of employment and would cause almost 700 ships to rot in idleness at their wharves. Not only would it affect those immediately engaged in these industries, but its blighting effects would topple the whole dependent economic structure. Coopers, tanners, barrel makers, and even farmers would be reduced to poverty and misery if the act were enforced. In short, the Sugar Act, by destroying the slave trade, would stop the wheels of New England industry. Now, that Sugar Act, I'm sure that you know your US history. I teach it. The Sugar Act is the first one of the acts that is imposed on the colonists after the 7 Years' War in order to pay for that war. Well, we start fighting immediately, don't we? Because it really would throw everything into topsy-turvy for the economy. Now, rum distilleries. This is the sort of, this is what we paid for slaves with, right? We had 118 in North America in 1770. Boston had 36. Newburyport had 10. Think about how big Newburyport was, right? Salem only had 5. Connecticut, 5. New Hampshire, 3. Rhode Island, 30. Not a big surprise there either. As I said earlier, Rhode Island had more to do with the slave trade than any other state or colony in the country. We had 2,059,000 gallons of rum, of which Massachusetts exported almost 1 million gallons. The rest of it we drank. I show this picture. It's obviously a photograph. It could not have been taken in the 1700s. We didn't have photography, but this is a sugarcane plantation in Jamaica. The average lifespan of someone working sugar in Jamaica was 7 years. It was cheaper to work someone to death and just replace them than to actually take care of them and feed them properly. On the eve of the American Revolution in 1773, the population of Newburyport numbered 3,000. At this time, the total number of adult males in Newburyport was 699. Of those men, the occupations of 84.7% of them were ascertained by Bernard Labouré. If one reflects on the number of people required to build and outfit a vessel, and earlier you may remember I said it took about 200 people, it is clear that almost everyone in Newburyport would have been involved in one way or another with the shipping trade, creating the basis for the economy in the town and its environs. What are the jobs that support this? Primarily with the West Indies. Tradesmen included painters, riggers, boat makers, coopers, tanners, and carvers. Before sailing, the ship required the services of instrument makers, chair makers, upholsterers to complete the officers' quarters, brewers, bakers, butchers to supply provisions. You don't go without food. Fishermen caught and packed the cod and the mackerel, which was traded for sugar and molasses. Innkeeping women provided bed and board for the mariners. Ordinary farmers and artisans spent their free time shaving shingles and making pipe staves. That's a lot of people involved there. And speaking of cod, the cod that was shipped to the West Indies to feed the enslaved who were working sugar was the lowest grade, because the highest grade cod was being sent over to the Catholic countries in Europe, but the lowest grade was sent down to the West Indies. So merchants and professional men numbered 173. That included 14 distillers, 36 merchants, and 83 shipmasters. Maritime artisans were 136. Those are all skilled jobs. Shopkeepers and inn holders, we had 27, including 3 innkeepers. Laborers and others, you always need that, 79. Domestic artisans, blacksmiths and joiners, you had 117. Everyone in town was somehow connected with the ships that were being built. Now, this is a famous picture, which echoes the one that is in the Custom House Maritime Museum. This is the Brooks. And in 1781, that's when this came out. The English began the abolition movement before we did. And what this represents is showing how the bodies are laid in just as sandwiches, sort of on layers, and they're chained and they can't get up. And that trip across the Middle Passage is at least a month. It's actually unimaginable. One of the originals of this is in the Peabody Essex Museum, which is where I saw it. So this began to make people think about what was happening here. Yes, these people are property, but they're people. So William Lloyd Garrison, son of Newburyport, in 1830, he is invited to speak on abolition in Newburyport, and the doors were locked when he came to give his second speech. He was too radical. He began publishing the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston in 1831. And in 1832, he founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society, which eventually became part of the American Anti-Slavery Society. This is the history we like to think about in Newburyport. We like to think about Garrison and the Garrison Inn and the statue we have of him. And we like to think of ourselves as being the home of an abolitionist. This is good history. But we really didn't want to hear what he had to say. In 1835, he was put in jail in Boston. He was actually giving a talk at Faneuil Hall, and he had to be ushered out through the back, snuck out through the back, because an angry crowd of people out front wanted to tar and feather him. He was put in jail for his own safekeeping. So he was an immediatist. We had gradualists and we had immediatists when it comes to abolitionists, but he did not actually believe in immediate racial equality. He believed in gradual racial equality. He just believed in immediate freedom. Now, Massachusetts actually abolished slavery in 1783, but it is basically because of a court case. It isn't because we rose up and said, oh, this is terrible. It was a court case, and it was found to be unconstitutional with our Constitution, our state constitution. During the creation of the US Constitution, there were discussions of ending the slavery, and my students at Littleton High School go through all of the notes that Madison kept about the discussions that were had about what they should do about slavery. And, you know, one of the issues here is that South Carolina and Georgia basically said, well, we are not going to sign any kind of a constitution, and we will leave if you don't say that we can keep slavery. And so it was decided to do a 20-year postponement on this. They really didn't have a lot going for them. Not in 1787. We don't even have the cotton gin yet. So we could have called their bluff and ended this then, but we did not. So in 1807, Britain outlaws the slave trade. In 1801, January 1st, the law prohibiting the importation of slaves to the US goes into effect. This was the promise that was made. But we do have the cotton gin by now. And all of a sudden, we have a cotton economy. And so we get a lot of interstate slave trade. In 1833, Britain abolishes slavery. We do not abolish slavery until 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, after we have fought a civil war. Now, in Ohio, I grew up believing that the people in the North were the good guys. We wore white hats. We were fighting to end slavery, and we won, and everything was good. Well, it wasn't good, and that isn't why we went to war. We went to war to preserve the Union. We did not go to war to end slavery. That became part of the purpose in 1863. And that is after the Emancipation Proclamation, which incidentally did not free anybody. It did not. So more states in the North. Vermont in 1777, they actually prohibited it by state constitution, though there were a few slaves there. Pennsylvania, 1789, this is gradual abolition legislation. Massachusetts, as you know, by Supreme Court ruling. New Hampshire, 1783, 1780, the accounts vary. There's no judicial records to verify that abolition. Rhode Island, 1784, that was gradual, and boy, did that take a long time. And Connecticut, the same thing, and New York. Speaking of Pennsylvania, they had a law that this was part of this gradual legislation, that if an enslaved person lived in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, for more than 6 months, that individual would be free. Well, where was our second White House? Our first one was in New York, moved rather quickly down to Philadelphia. And George Washington was president for 2 terms, and then John Adams. Both lived in the president's house in Philadelphia. And Adams, as you may know, was completely against slavery, and he never owned any other human being. But Washington had hundreds of slaves, and he had slaves brought up from Mount Vernon to the president's house in Philadelphia. And he knew about this law. So just before the 6 months was up, he would send them back down and trade them for other ones. But one also knew, and she escaped before the 6 months, and he went looking for her. It's a great story about Una Judge. So Newburyport becomes a stop on the Underground Railroad. About the same time, William Lloyd Garrison is making his first abolitionist speech in Boston in 1829 at Park Street Church. Aiding runaways, however, was done really in strict secrecy, because those who did so were found out, were punished to the full extent of the law. The town's economy was still very much tied to the free labor provided by enslaved people and the trade in the West Indies. We could not stop that. Reliance on slave labor after abolition. Well, after the slave trade is ended in 1808, the transatlantic, we have Francis Cabot Lowell of Newburyport. He opens with his partners the Boston Manufacturing Company in Waltham in 1813. And this is the first fully integrated mill from, raw cotton to fabric. Well, the River Charles, or as I call it, the River Chuck, was not strong enough. So they ended up coming up to the Merrimack, and the city of Lowell was named for him and created by 1819. We've got our first mills there. This was the beginning of the cotton and textile mills that were everywhere. And it was encouraging a class of New Englanders whose cotton interests caused them to sympathize with Southern slavery. What would we do without that free labor? Who are the beneficiaries of slavery? Well, slave owners, obviously. Owners and investors of ships, shipbuilders and the many craftsmen involved, mariners, farmers, fishermen, merchants, distillers, consumers. And this is quite a while after the Civil War. This is a speech by a South Carolina congressman in March of 1884. Massachusetts is a state more responsible under heaven than any other community in this land for the introduction of slavery into this continent, with all the curses that have followed it, that it is the nursing mother of the horrors of the Middle Passage and that after slavery in Massachusetts was found not to pay, her slaves were sold down south for a consideration, and then their former owners thanked God and sang the long meter doxology through their noses that they were responsible no longer for the sin of human slavery. This is how we forgot. So we talk about the perpetuation of race. If we have the amendment to the US Constitution, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, why today are we still dealing with issues of race? Well, in 1868, we have the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to anyone born here and equal rights under the law. It wasn't enough just to abolish slavery. And then the 14th Amendment wasn't enough to just guarantee that Black men could vote. We get the 15th Amendment in 1870. But this all backfires when Reconstruction ends in 1877 and the Union troops leave the South who had been enforcing this. In 1896, our Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson says segregation in public spaces is legal. This does not get overturned by the Supreme Court until 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation in schools is unconstitutional, which then, of course, means segregation in public spaces really was. In 1965, we have the Voting Rights Act, outlawing discriminatory voting practices adopted in many Southern states after the Civil War. Well, racism today. In 2008, the House issued an apology for the enslavement and racial segregation of African Americans. Barack Obama was elected as the first Black president of the US. In 2012, Trayvon Martin was shot in Florida, and that began the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2020, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin, and Black Lives Matter protests take place across the country. I know you know about that. And in March of 2021, the House passed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, reintroduced in the US House of Representatives, and over almost 5,000 people were lynched between 1882 and 1968. There had been anti-lynching acts introduced into Congress since the beginning of the 20th century. They were never, ever passed. So how does this history relate to our lives today? Well, whether our ancestors owned human beings or not, we as white Americans have benefited from the economy created by the use of free labor provided by enslaved Africans. We have benefited by laws created to sustain our advantages and privileges in housing, education, employment, and in ways we usually do not even acknowledge. How do we reckon with that inheritance? While we also celebrate the history of our maritime innovations and relationship with the sea. This is hard. This is hard. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. This is when I invite everyone to please turn on their microphone or video if they'd like to ask a question. This is a topic that is very pertinent on the front of everyone's minds these days. So I appreciate you reconstructing historically an informative manner that was provided to us this evening. I do have one question that sort of piqued my curiosity when you mentioned that Rhode Island was sort of one of the major leaders of New England for slavery. I was surprised because Rhode Island is also one of the smallest states of land mass, and I understand there's so much water, but did you have any, or could you provide any insight as to why that was? Were there more ports? Were there more statutory laws that allowed? Were there the means of dispersing these arrivals to be sold at different destinations. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Well, I'll try to. One of the reasons that I became interested in this topic to begin with was back in the 2000s when I began teaching. I attended a workshop at Brown University, and I learned about the DeWolf family from Bristol, Rhode Island. And they literally made more money in the slave trade than any other family. They also got some favors from the government, who just, the customs officials turned around and just didn't see those ships coming in. And I mean, the real name is Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. There were plantations. It's the Narragansett horses that were going down to West Indies. They continued. They also had a slave trading in Cuba. They had a plantation in Cuba. So they were able to just go back and forth to Cuba from Rhode Island, and then getting slaves from Africa there and bringing back. They also traded a great deal in New York. I mean, New York, we like to think about New York as being a northern city, right? New York actually thought about seceding with the South because the slave trade was so important to New York economy. This is sort of this Pandora's box that's being opened, and I'm learning something just about every day about this. But Rhode Island, of course, is surrounded by water, and they had some people in their pockets so that they could do what they needed to do. And it's very, very well documented. So thanks for that question.
Anybody else?
I have a question for Susan.
Yes.
First of all, your presentation is sobering and very thought-provoking. But you said that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free anyone. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I'm happy to. Lincoln thought about doing this in the summer of '82, and he was advised by his cabinet not to do this because the Union was actually losing the war. And they said, you've got to have some kind of a, they were nervous about him doing it in the first place because no one was convinced that having blacks freed was a good idea. And Lincoln himself was somebody who was a fan of the American Colonization Society, saying that blacks and whites couldn't really live together and they really needed to go to Liberia. So this is a man who is not somebody, I mean, he said, you know, the black man can do whatever he wants to do, and I don't need to marry that woman or whatever. Okay, so we've got the Emancipation Proclamation. He's working on it in the summer, and his cabinet says, don't do this until we have a win. Well, that turns out to be Antietam in September. If you know anything about that battle, each side calls it a win, right? Because we stop the Confederates from moving north, and the Union lost a lot of people that day. It was the bloodiest day of the Civil War. And so then he says, all right, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this, for January 1st. Well, if you really read the Emancipation Proclamation, he frees all of the slaves in the states he has no control over. He does not free one slave in any of the border states. There are counties in southern states that, even though he has no control over the southern states, he says those slaves in those counties are not free. So we just hear the Emancipation Proclamation and he's freed the slaves. Isn't it great? He didn't do anything. The slaves freed themselves. Once they learned that this had been issued, then as the Union Army moved south, they came up. The key thing about this is that it did allow Black men to enlist in the Army. That's when we started doing that. And that in January was the very first, right that January, the governor of Massachusetts said, we have to do this. And we're going to put together the 54th. And if you've seen the movie Glory, or you know anything about that 54th monument across from the State House just gives me chills. It's an amazing piece of work by Augustus St. Gaudens. That's what did it. You know, it's like you're seeing slaves moving forward. They hear this is happening. They run to Union lines. The Union's moving south. Anytime they take over a space, then they're freed. But he had no control over them. So he was paper. The main thing that did was it allowed Black men in the North to enlist. And when Southerners got hold of him, they were brutal. So that's what I mean by that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have one. This is Chris Cernick. It's also an observation or a comment. Susan, your presentation was just superb. And as someone previously said, incredibly sobering to just look at the systematic structure of slavery of Blacks.
Mhm.
And as you were talking about it, I began to think about slavery in total, not just Black slavery, but what happened as Black slavery began to see some decline for a variety of reasons. What then happened was then we had immigrant slavery. So it wasn't free slavery, but it was poorly paid for the work that those immigrants did. And it's interesting for me to note that our country is in many ways built upon slavery.
Mhm. It is. You're
It was-
absolutely correct.
Certainly Black slavery, but then we look at the whole immigration pattern of whites, and now we can begin to look at the immigration pattern of other folks of color who are in our country,
Mhm.
and what is happening around the slavery of those populations. It is just astonishing, this whole concept of ownership.
Yes, it is astonishing. I think, you know, we're at school right now, we're talking about the antebellum period, and we've been looking at the Industrial Revolution. So of course, we've been looking at the mills in Lowell. Well, by 1840, almost 50% of the people working there were Irish women immigrants, and they were being paid a pittance and stopped from unionizing. And, you know.
And they were young girls,
Yes, they were.
10 years old.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So child slavery as well. It is
Absolutely.
just astonishing.
It's a capitalist society.
Has
Thanks,
to hurt
Teresa.
our heart, doesn't it?
It does hurt my heart. There's no question about it. My goal was to find out if my family was involved in the slave trade, and I need to do more research. What I do know, that when Anthony Morse died in the 1600s, he owed Paul White 10 pounds. That's a significant amount of money at that point in the 1660s. And I don't know what he was doing. Maybe he was just buying rum. I have no idea. But rum is a product of the slave trade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A provocative presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well said. I was thinking the same thought, Chris. Any other questions? We're a little bit over, but interesting conversation.
I do see a raised hand, but I'm not sure I can do anything about that.
Susan, this is Susan Bernhard.
Okay.
And
Hi.
thank you very much for your lecture tonight. I guess from someone who's been in the Custom House many times, we think of the ships being built as being sold for the products of, for the premise of supplying goods, right?
Right, right.
So the shipbuilders of Newburyport in the time, they're building a ship, they're selling that ship to a merchant to pick up rum or to sell the goods from New England. So as an exporter, we're an exporter, right?
Right.
But from your lecture, what you're stating is those exports were going into helping the slave trade.
That's
You're
right.
not saying that those ships were actually part of being sold to slave traders. They're just part of the slave trade. Is that
It was
correct?
both. It was both. Most of the ships and the ships that were built here that were used in the West Indies trade were mostly snows, and that's really our economy right there. That's how Mr. Bartlett made his money. And you know, if you put sugar in your tea or in your coffee, you're supporting the slave trade. So when you begin to look at the abolitionists, like the crazy Alcotts out at Fruitlands, if anybody's been to Fruitlands, if you haven't been, you have to go.
Yeah.
You know, they refused to do anything that had anything to do with slave labor. They wouldn't even shear the sheep. I don't understand that part, but you know, they would not use sugar. They would not use anything of cotton, nothing, because that would implicate them in supporting it.
Therefore, the original supply chain.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, again, thank you very much, Susan. I really appreciate your time and preparation and talking with us this evening. I thank everybody for joining us, and I think there's a couple thumbs up that are coming on the screen, so you should applaud yourself for that. And really, again, I hope to see you at the Customs House and help you further with your research.
You darn well better not retire before I get there, okay? And thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. I hope you're all safe and warm in your homes and not out on those crazy streets. Oh my gosh. All right. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.